Hello friends, welcome to my channel and explore the world of Microsoft Azure. My name is Rajneesh Kaushik and I'm a Microsoft certified trainer, consultant and an enterprise architect. For more latest videos and blogs, you can always log into my website rajneeshkaushik.com and subscribe to my blog. Please do not forget to subscribe my channel and click the bell icon so you don't miss the latest videos. Do like, share and comment. Azure Kubernetes Services or AKS has emerged as a leading container orchestration platform, and it offers plethora of features which can streamline your development, deployment, management and scaling of containerized applications. One of the standout feature for AKS is its flexibility to offer both public and private clusters along with the VNet integration. In this vlog, we are going to discover more about these features and how to use these features and what are the best practices around these features. So let's get started. Best practices to deploy Azure Kubernetes services in a production environment. Here is the agenda. First, we are going to learn about overview of AKS and its key features. What are the importance of securing the AKS cluster? Then we will understand the public clusters in AKS service, private clusters in AKS service, and public clusters with VNet integration and private cluster with VNet integration. Then we will differentiate between these features about private, public, and VNet integration and the best practices for securing the AKS clusters. And then we will discuss about the FAQs and then conclude this session. Okay, so let's learn what is AKS and what are its key features. First of all, AKS is a Microsoft Azure managed Kubernetes services. There are other managed Kubernetes services as well, like OpenShift. So similarly, Microsoft has its own managed Kubernetes services called AKS. And how this is very important because it is hosted in the Azure infrastructure. It simplifies the deployment and managing of the Kubernetes clusters. It also has a very important feature for automatic upgrades, monitoring and scaling of the containerized workloads. And this because this is already in the Azure ecosystem and you can use all the Azure related services with it to develop your applications. It provides a very robust environment for deploying the containerized applications at a large scale. That means you can scale it to any level. Okay, so let's first learn about the importance of securing your Azure Kubernetes Services cluster. So first and foremost, it's very important and crucial because of the increasing digital threats coming now. Now there are lots of virus attacks are happening. Hackers are trying to hack your clusters, right? As per the latest digital trends, every couple of minutes, if you see that lots of AKS clusters, they are getting hacked because of they are exposed publicly. So this is very real threat and it is important that you secure your AKS cluster. AKS, especially if you are securing a sensitive data or PII data and you want that your data should be uninterrupted, your service should be uninterrupted without hacker hacking it and stealing the data, then it is very critical for you to secure your AKS cluster. And with the security comes the reputation of the organization or enterprise and it builds a trust in your customer. So it's very important for securing your AKS cluster. Let's understand what is public clusters in AKS. Public clusters are the clusters which is created in Azure, but they are accessible from the internet. And you might be thinking, why do I need a public cluster? Because public clusters are most ideal for applications where you require a public accessibility. That means if you are hosting a website where it is publicly accessed by the users, then it is the best approach. It could also host a API which is exposed to the internet where people are calling that API. So there are lots of benefits, like you can access this application from anywhere in the world, and it also provides a very simplified networking setup so that anybody can access this public clusters. Let's understand how the public cluster is managed and how it is deployed. So first and foremost, your public cluster, there are two set of things. One is a AKS control plane, another one is a node pool or a worker nodes. So whenever a user is trying to access the application, either he's there are two use cases predominantly. You are using kubectl command or you are using Azure DevOps pipeline. So these two tools, they are accessing the AKS cluster, which is hosted in the Azure with the public IP, and control plane is accessible with the public IP address, and the node pool or worker node is also accessing the control plane with the help of public IP address. So control plane is exposed on the public FQDN, which is the FQDN, from the, which is when you create a service in AKS, it creates a FQDN, and control plane is exposed to the internet. So if this is the case, then you would like to whitelist the IP addresses so that only the whitelisted IP addresses are accessing your AKS. So you need to restrict the IP addresses so that only restricted IP address can access your public IP address. Public does not mean that anybody and everybody can access the public IP address. So this is very, very important and one of the best practice. What is private cluster in AKS? Private clusters are required when you don't want to expose your API server or the application into the internet, and you want that your API is restricted or accessible only within the specific virtual network. It offers a enhanced security, and it is most ideal for the sensitive applications where you don't want to expose your sensitive application to your public domain. And this is very, very critical design because it's very important for you to understand how this whole thing works. And one of the critical aspect of providing a private cluster by AKS is it is actually used in the most of the enterprise application implementation. So this is very, very critical. Let's understand how the public clusters work. For public cluster, any application like Azure DevOps pipeline or kubectl, they cannot access it your private AKS cluster. As you know that AKS cluster has AKS control plane and the worker nodes. So AKS control plane is always hosted in the Microsoft managed subscription whenever you create AKS cluster, and the access to the kubectl command or Azure DevOps is restricted from the public IP address, and all the access from the worker node or anybody can only have access with the private endpoint. So there is a private endpoint which is created for the control plane, and your worker node can only access the AKS control plane with the help of this endpoint. And if you want to use this VM or if you want to use this AKS cluster, you need to deploy a jump box in your VNet. That jump box will have access to the private endpoint, and with that private endpoint you will have access to the AKS control plane. So control plane is exposed on the public FQDN but with the private IP address. Okay, so even if it is exposed, but it is with the private IP address, because this private IP address with the private endpoint, and control plane is not at all exposed to the internet. Public FQDN could be disabled or enabled. So there is a public FQDN, but you should disable it because you don't want to expose it outside. And worker node can always connect to the control plane through a private endpoint. So another thing you need to understand is private FQDN is resolvable only through private DNS zone, which is here in the right side. So this private FQDN, which is here, is resolved through the private DNS. Okay, so let's now understand public AKS cluster with VNet integration. So it is a different kind of deployment, and it provides you flexibility of exposing the cluster with the public endpoint as well as providing a VNet integration, which means that with the VNet integration you can consume all the Azure services. So let's understand it. If you want API server VNet integration, it actually enhances your security and flexibility of deployment, right? So with this approach you can allows the AKS clusters to connect to the existing Azure VNet resources. If there are VNet resources which is already there in the VNet, you can connect to those VNet resources. It keeps the traffic within the Azure network and minimize the external exposure, which means that your traffic is exposed within the same VNet. It does not go outside, and this is most preferred approach whether you are using public AKS cluster or private AKS cluster with VNet integration. VNet integration is a most it is one of the best practice. It optimizes the communication pathway for containerized application. So because your traffic is remains within the same VNet, so it optimizes the communication pathway. So let's understand it. So this approach which you have already seen here in the public cluster is same. Only difference is that your worker node is accessing to the control plane with the help of a load balancer, which is deployed in the control plane integration subnet. So there is a subnet which is delegated to the AKS, and in that subnet you have a load balancer. So whenever a worker node tries to call the AKS control plane, it actually uses this load balancer to call the control plane. And then this control plane, there is a subnet which is a delegated subnet for the AKS work, and this subnet is where the traffic is moving from load balancer to the managed subscription of AKS, where the AKS control plane is hosted. So there are advantages of this design where control plane is exposed on the public FQDN with the public IP address. That means if somebody wants to access from the public IP address, he can access it. The control plane endpoint is exposed to the internet, which is with the public control plane IP address. Public FQDN could not be disabled except on private cluster. So there is a public FQDN, and you don't want to disable the public FQDN. If you are using a private cluster with the same configuration, you can use the same, like you can disable it. DevOps or CI/CD pipeline can still access it with the help of the public endpoint. Worker nodes access it with the internal load. This is internal load balancer. So this is how the internal load balancer is connecting it, and it creates direct access, so that whenever so your traffic remains here inside it, or it is exposed for the kubectl or DevOps service with the public endpoint. So this is how this is secure. Now let's learn what is private AKS cluster with VNet integration. So again, this is a highest security. It provides the highest level of security and provides a elevated security and network optimization. So in this case, API server is only accessible within the designated Azure VNet, and it provides something like a very isolated kind of environment. That way you can safeguard your data and communication. This is a most secure way, and it streamlines the network traffic for the efficient communication. So let's understand how it works. So here your public access is disabled, right? The remaining design remains the same. Access to the AKS control plane is with the help of load balancer, but here your public access is completely disabled. So which means that your traffic is always in your VNet, right? And there is a subnet which is delegated here for the AKS service. So this is a most secure way. You are not exposing your workload to the public, and your traffic remains private. So difference between private, public and VNet integrations. So in the public clusters, we have a public IP address and FQDN for the control plane, right? We already know that. Private cluster, we have a private endpoint and private DNS zone. So that with the private endpoint, when you try to access the cluster, you have a private DNS zone where it can point you. VNet integration, what we do with the VNet integration with public cluster, we use VNet integration feature plus internal load balancer. And with the private cluster, we also use VNet integration with internal load balancer. So what are the differences? Public cluster has a public IP address. Private cluster actually has a public FQDN but with a private IP. VNet integration with the public cluster, we have a public IP address. VNet integration plus private cluster, we have only private IP address. Private FQDN, there is no private FQDN for public cluster. There is a private FQDN for private clusters, and for all of them. Public FQDN can be deactivated. For public cluster, you cannot deactivate it. For private clusters, you can do it. With the public cluster, again, with this VNet integration, you don't have to do it. But here with the private cluster, you can do it. So this is how the control plane accesses it. Control plane accesses with the public FQDN, and with the private cluster, it uses a private DNS zone with a private endpoint. With the VNet integration feature plus load balancer, it actually accesses the control plane when you use VNet integration feature for both of these private or public clusters. Best practices for securing the clusters. So most of the best practices especially when you want to secure your AKS cluster, is regularly update and patch the AKS nodes, so that if there are some vulnerability in the AKS versions, you can immediately patch it and secure your cluster. You have to also make sure that you have a strict access control for the servers, right? Anybody and everybody should not access it, so there should be a proper user groups created. In that groups you should have access to only those people who want to access the clusters. You need to also make sure that you have a enhanced monitoring mechanism, so that you can, if there are some suspicious activities happening on the cluster, you can track them. And always use a private cluster whenever you have your application which exposes the sensitive or PII data. So that is, these are the best practices for securing. There are certain FAQs about the public and private clusters. So what are the difference in public and private clusters? First and foremost, public cluster is exposed on the public endpoint or internet. Private clusters are not exposed publicly. Second question is, how does API server VNet integration enhances the security? VNet integration enhances the security by putting your traffic within the same VNet without exposing it outside. And this is the most recommended pattern for restricting the application, especially when you have a sensitive data in your system. What are the best practices for securing the AKS cluster? We just discussed that there are servers need to be patched. You should use private clusters. Don't expose a sensitive data outside, right? And another question comes that how can you switch from public to the private cluster? So there are design decisions if you want to convert the public cluster to the private, but again you need to design it very carefully, and then you can convert the public cluster to the private cluster. So there are some re-architecture required in that, and it's not really straightforward, but yeah, you need to design it in terms of the landing zone design of the AKS cluster. Thanks for watching, and do not forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you